from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. I'm going to discuss a number of things today. There's a lot going on around the world. So I'm going to talk about, I don't know if you want to say the front lines of war, but certainly a lot of flashpoints, conflict zones, issues that are being worked on, things that could turn into really big wars. So I'm going to get into this and talk about it. And with that, I'm going to start by talking about something very topical. Of course, you know, we all remember October 7th, the big attack by Hamas against Israel, just a horrific death and carnage. And of course, everything that's come since with Israel going into Gaza and just massive destruction, death, suffering that's taken place from that. And that's all in the background. With that, we have what happened with Hezbollah. They were up in Lebanon. They jumped in shortly after Hamas did their thing, and they started launching drones and missiles into Israel, basically in simpatico, if you will, with their other Iranian proxy member, which was Hamas. And then we started seeing things from the Iraqi militias, the Shiite militias there, where they were doing things in support of Hamas. And of course, Bashar Assad's government in Syria was the linchpin which connects, basically Iran through Iraq into southern Lebanon, providing that huge conduit and gateway to get all that Iranian Al-Quds IRGC support for all these proxies. Anyway, all of that has been in the background. And of course, now with that, there's been strikes, certainly ballistic missiles and drones launched by Iran against Israel. Israel responding. Israel's last thing was they took out a lot of air defense over in Iran. So a lot of this has happened, but one of the big things, probably the biggest thing that underlies all of this is Iran's desire to develop a nuclear weapon, or I should say nuclear weapons. And that has, everything else pales in comparison to the potential destruction or destructive force of this radical theocratic regime in Iran having nuclear weapons. And certainly, if you recall, with the JCPOA, that agreement that was put together under the Obama administration that the first Trump administration canceled, there's been a big desire all along to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Well, since that was stopped, Iran has ramped up its production of highly enriched uranium, 60% pure, the stuff that's capable of being transferred into a potentially nuclear weapon in a very short period of time. It's estimated that Iran could do this within weeks, not months, not years, but within weeks if they wanted to. Of course, one of the big issues was that Iran also had this massive ballistic missile capability, drone capability, everything else. So with that said, this has been a big issue. And the U.S. has basically told Iran, knock it off. You cannot have nuclear weapons. And this is back at the, the front burner, if you will. Israel has been saying the same thing. But a lot of this is because the proxies have been knocked off one by one. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. So Saturday, April 12th, Steve Witkoff, presidential envoy for both Ukraine and the Middle East, went to Oman. He met with the Iranian foreign minister and Araghchi, and with the Omani foreign minister, basically acting as the interlocutor or intermediary between those two. Now, the Iranians are calling it indirect talks. The U.S. calls it direct talks. The reality is, they weren't sitting at the same table talking to each other. I understand they were in different rooms, and the Omanis were going back and forth with different proposals, discussions, whatever. Really seemed kind of strange to me because Steve Witkoff going into this had said this is about trust building. I don't know how much trust you build when you can't even sit in the same room at the same table with the other side. But he called it trust building. He said nothing was going to come of this, and it was the first direct talks that the U.S. has had, but it wasn't really direct talks. It was kind of direct, indirect talks, if you will, that they'd had. But anyway, they went through, and the only thing that came out of it was they agreed that they're going to meet next weekend or meet on the 19th of April and make this happen. All right, so that's pretty much what came from that. Interestingly, Steve Witkoff was literally coming straight from St. Petersburg, where he was meeting with Vladimir Putin, and they were talking about the Ukrainian war. And there is rampant discussion out there about, he's become the everything ambassador, as they say. He's a real estate guy. He's not an international diplomat or anything. He's a real estate guy, smart guy, but a real estate guy. He negotiates real estate deals, and basically President Trump uses him to do all these things, but he's coming from one thing where he's talking about the Ukrainian war or war in Ukraine, and then he's going right to this thing in the Middle East. And I just don't know. I don't know of anyone that can really, negotiate something as complex as nuclear weapons development and, atomic, dealing with atomic energy or atomic capabilities and everything else that deals with the threat of the Iranian nuclear program right after you've done this other thing. It seems like he's doing a lot. All right. And this has been a big criticism, if you will. So to kind of sum it all up, Steve Witkoff is, he's a lead for the Ukraine-Russia war. He's our lead on Gaza, the Middle East. He's a lead on the Iranian discussions. He's just got a lot of stuff that he's working on. And he's been popping over to Europe and been part of or showing up at meetings with NATO and all sorts of things. So it does make it sound like he may have a little too much put on his plate. And certainly if I was Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, I'd be kind of scratching my head on this because I'm not sure that Steve Witkoff really reports to Marco Rubio. It sounds like he reports directly to President Trump. So it's an unusual relationship. Not the first time we've seen that, but usually it causes a lot of friction in any administration. Nixon was kind of doing the same thing with Kissinger. When Kissinger was over in the National Security Council as the National Security Advisor, and it did cause a lot of friction back in that time. All right. So what's coming out of this? Well, it's very interesting. What does the U.S. want? Israel and actually Trump in the first administration was talking about what a horrible deal it was that Obama put in there, that he didn't include the ballistic missile program that Iran had, that certainly didn't need any discussion about their support of terrorist proxies throughout the region. However, as of most recent stuff, President Trump has talked about, the red line for the U.S. is they can't have a nuclear weapon. Okay. With that said, I'm not sure how that's that different from what was in the JCPOA, because the criticism of the JCPOA, the Obama era agreement, was that it just focused on nuclear weapons, and now we're saying our sole goal is nuclear weapons. Now, there's others in the administration have kind of been saying, that we're also looking at ballistic missiles and their support to proxy, stuff like that. But it does sound a little bit odd that we're just saying nuclear weapons. And if that is our only goal, then I'm kind of scratching my head saying, well, why did we get rid of the original JCPOA if that's our only goal? So it does sound a little bit odd. Iran has said its red lines. They have a number of things in there, but one of the big red lines they've said is that nothing can touch their defense sector. In other words, nothing can impact their military and defense sector, which includes the IRGC, Al-Quds forces, all of that stuff, because they have kind of this bifurcated military model. I won't get into all the details, but they've said nothing can touch that defense sector, and that would include their production. When you're saying that would include the production of ballistic missiles, drones, ballistic missiles and drones that get exported to Russia, and then Russia uses those to attack Ukraine. And I don't know if the U.S. is going to respect that part of it. I do see where this could cause some real friction between Bibi Netanyahu and President Trump, because Israel's position on this is that they need to talk about the ballistic missiles and they need to talk about these proxies that Iran has. So I'm not quite sure what's going to come from that. All right. There's a lot of issues that have to be discussed there. And again, I would remind everyone that, Iran is about 2 to 3 weeks from taking everything they have now and putting together a potential nuclear warhead. All right. Now, what are Iran's proxies? Well, just to kind of go through it, you got Hamas that's in Gaza and kind of the West Bank. They have been severely decimated, their military capabilities decimated, although in terms of raw recruiting numbers, they're almost back where they were before the war started, which is a real frustration for Israel. They've got the personnel. They don't have all the capability that they had. That's been largely destroyed. But then I've seen stuff that says potentially 75% of their underground tunnel network in Gaza may be intact. So there's a lot of issues that deal with Hamas there. Hezbollah, and instead of Lebanon, Hezbollah was, of course, massive devastation from the the pager attacks, the walkie-talkie attacks, all the missile attacks, taking out all their leadership targets, everything else. The ceasefire, which is now expired, but kind of being held in place, if you will. So that's different. Syria, of course, that was the other nation state proxy, if you will. That was Iran's big stick, if you will, in that Shia crescent, was that Bashar Assad from the Alawite clan, which is Shiite, they'd be supporting Hezbollah. They would be, part of the mix on Iraq. They were putting pressure on Israel. They were doing all these things. They were kind of, covertly helping Hamas. And so they were there, and now they're gone. And I'm not saying that Syria is a proxy of Turkey, but without Turkey, it doesn't seem that the HTS-led government, which is actually led by someone who used to be the head of al-Qaeda for Syria, would have ever come to power or defeated the Assad government. So that's all changed. And by the way, that's a Sunni extremist branch, which is absolutely opposed to the Shiites. Each side sees the other side as heretics. And in fact, it's been mentioned many times that the rift between the Sunnis and the Shiites in Islam is probably greater than the differences or conflict between, the Israel or the Israeli Jews and Muslim extremists. So, take that for what it is. And then in Iraq, there's a kind of a movement for the Iraqi Shiite militias to basically either lay down their arms or roll into being elements of the Iraqi government. And part of that is because they do not want to become targets of the U.S. or Israel in whatever happens. And they're looking at what's going on in Iran. So they're very nervous about what's happening. And then the Houthi network is basically getting bombed every day. And we've got B-2 bombers down Diego Garcia. We've used B-2s to attack some of those deep bunker-type targets in Yemen that the Houthis have. That sounded like it was a very successful strike. And now we got 6 B-2s sitting much, much closer down in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. Potentially, they could do sorties of B-2 bombers striking Houthi targets every day. By the way, they could also do sorties every day striking Iranian targets, going after some of those deep underground targets where the Iranians keep things like their nuclear program materials and stuff like that. All right. And certainly Iran's support of the war in Ukraine with everything, and even helping Russia set up production of drones in Russia. That's big. And then the next step is, if this discussion with Iran goes south, if nothing happens from it, what more can be done to hinder the Iran's ability to sell oil around the world? And that's a big thing. Iran's already getting hit hard, as is Russia, because oil prices are going down. So there's economic considerations to go with this too. All right, let's kind of switch gears and go talk about Russia with Steve Witkoff. First off, I got to tell you, this was a rather interesting situation. The rhetoric that has been coming from Steve Witkoff and others, I'm just going to say this straight out. All right. This whole thing about Ukraine holds no cards, Ukraine's losing the war. Ukraine has fought very well throughout this war. They stopped the initial Russian invasion cold, and then they rolled back a big chunk of it. Now, they were not successful in the summer of 2023 in going into Zaporizhia and busting through the lines. That minefield was the minefields and the anti-tank obstacles and everything that went with it were far more extensive than they realized, and that Russian line largely held, and certainly Ukraine took some losses in that. But they have actually been doing some things since, and they went up into Kursk and basically used Kursk for what it was, to draw away Russian military resources away from places like the Donbass region, and basically causing enormous attrition of Russian forces, personnel and equipment in the Kursk operation. And now the Ukrainians are actually up in the Belgorod Oblast making an incursion, and again, drawing away Russian military resources from where they could put elsewhere on the front. So that whole thing about they're losing, I just don't buy it. It's never, Russia is not, in this big advance. Russia's got plans to do a big spring and summer offensive. They've done this massive recruitment program, and no doubt that a lot of those conscripts are going to be sent as basically sacrificial lambs onto whatever Russia thinks the tactical battlefield looks like, and you're going to lose a lot more Russians. And I should mention that by the end of May, if nothing changes and the numbers keep going the way they're going, the total losses that Russia has incurred in this war, in terms of manpower, those killed and seriously wounded, will be over 1 million. That's an enormous number. 1 million troops killed and wounded. And by the way, Russian medical care is so bad that if they do leave the battlefield alive, well, let's just say their future is looking pretty bleak if they survive for much longer. So that's out there. All right. And I also don't buy this thing about, I don't know why Steve Witkoff said this, these sham polls, these sham elections that Russia held in these occupied areas that said people want a Russian government. When you're sitting there and they're literally holding a gun, at least figuratively to your head, but they're sitting there and they're forcing them to look at their ballots publicly and say, do you want a Russian administration, or do you want to go over to this building over here and we're going to have a little talk with you? There's nothing there. That's a nothing burger as far as that. It's just propaganda. It's nothing. And I can't believe that a U.S. administration official would repeat something like that, because it's just not true. Those are Ukrainian territories. Yeah, there's a lot of ethnic Russians there, a very large percentage. That's an old Stalin thing from way back when he was trying to destroy Ukrainian nationalism. But a lot of those folks that used to speak primarily Russian have started speaking Ukrainian because they are so just beyond despair with how bad the Russian government is and everything that they've done in Ukraine. So I just can't believe we're saying that. Now, what's being reported is that Witkoff has offered 4 oblasts, basically Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, all right, along with Crimea that they occupied in 2014. I want to mention that I mentioned those 4 because those 4 appear to be at least 2 or 3 more than what Steve Witkoff was able to remember when he was being interviewed by Tucker Carlson a couple weeks back. So, first off, Russia doesn't control all those oblasts. A lot of them are part of that area is controlled by Ukraine. They've been fighting fiercely to maintain that. There's major cities in those areas, like Kherson, that they took back, that they control. And so he's talking about, well, maybe the deal is that basically Ukraine just cedes those provinces. And I look at this, I go, really? So if we have a tough time with China, do we just cede California, Oregon, and Washington State, maybe throw in Alaska while we're at it? I mean, what's the plan on that? But Ukraine cedes those areas in order to get a peace deal, as opposed to freezing it on the lines where they are now. So I don't get that. And I would say that's probably some of why the Ambassador Brink in Ukraine, our U.S. ambassador there, part of the mix of reasons why she's leaving is because she's listening to this stuff, and it is so antithetical to where we've been since this war began. It's just, it is rather surprising. And the other thing, too, is I think strategically it's a mess. Now, I hate to think that the White House is really so desperate to get a deal, any deal that even if it's a facade of peace or whatever. I think that would be a desperate thing to do, and we got to be careful. Getting a deal doesn't mean anything, and you can only spin this so far. Nobody can spin that Afghanistan ended well. I heard the Biden administration try to kind of spin it a little bit, that it wasn't as bad as what everybody saw. It was as bad as everybody saw, and you can only spin this so many ways. And if we do something in Ukraine where we put them in an impossible situation where they can't maintain a ceasefire, if all we're doing is just handing land over, if we're giving Putin everything he wants, to say U.S. credibility around the world is shattered, is to put it lightly. U.S. credibility is kind of shaky right now, certainly with NATO and our Asian allies as it is. But to do something like that, basically no country will trust the U.S., and that's already becoming an issue around the world. It's becoming an issue with the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. The dollar, since this tariff war kicked off, the dollar's been falling, and a lot of countries are looking at moving to other currencies, and so the U.S. would not be the reserve currency. And if that's the case, the whole global system changes, and we have put ourselves in a massive economic hurt locker because of that. So we got to be careful about these things. I'm not saying that a ceasefire in Ukraine would be a Pyrrhic victory, but it could be. And it could be something where, we literally are trying to, stop the war by losing the war, and that would be the perception. By the way, I would also mention that the withdrawal of Afghanistan was something that was negotiated directly between the U.S. and the Taliban, and we left out the Afghan national government. Now we're negotiating directly with the Russians, and we're leaving out the Ukrainian national government. And frankly, that pattern is seen all around the world, and the Ukrainians have to agree to whatever's going on. Nothing can be really imposed on them per se in that regard. There are limitations even to U.S. power. I would hope that we've learned that lesson throughout history. But now, can Europe, if the U.S. gets frustrated, and there's word that President Trump is getting frustrated with Zelensky. The minerals deal, the U.S. keeps throwing more things in. They want to take over this big pipeline to get Russian natural gas shipped from Russia through Ukraine, and they want to take ownership of that along with this huge minerals thing. And this minerals deal, I don't know if that's ever going to come about, just because the U.S. keeps throwing more conditions on. It kind of reminds me in some ways of like with Bibi Netanyahu with whatever deal they're trying to do in Gaza, that he throws a few more conditions on it and it becomes insurmountable to get an agreement for an extended ceasefire or an additional ceasefire or whatever it is. Well, we're doing that with the minerals deal, and obviously that's not moving very quickly. So I'm not quite sure where this is going to go. No, so the question would be, was the U.S. going to again cut off all aid, delivery of aid to Ukraine? Is it going to cut off all intelligence support? Can the Europeans replace that? Well, the Europeans can do more on the intelligence support thing now than they could, say, a month ago. I will say that. The Europeans are still well behind the power curve on their defense industrial base across the board and can't easily replace what the U.S. is doing, although they are making some big strides to do so. And then the question is, you're dealing with European unity, and that's always been a sticky issue because you got a lot of different countries, 30-some countries, and they got to agree. And, countries like Hungary are just literally kind of almost in the Russian camp, if you will. So it's really difficult to see how that comes about. So let me talk about China and the trade war, if I may. All right. Got a few things to discuss here. Okay. If you want to call it a tariff war or a trade war, but I think, the U.S. has got, 145% tariffs on China. China is now up to 125%. The U.S. President Trump just said he's going to take off a bunch of electronic stuff like laptops and cell phones and things like that, which Wall Street, I can tell you the markets, and certainly a number of tech billionaires and CEOs will be thrilled that that's taking place. Politically, I think he's going to kind of take a hit on that because they're going to say, okay, look, it's a charged political environment. There will be accusations that, in the standoff between Xi and Trump, who blinked first. Well, that's just kind of what it is. That's how it's going to get played out in the press. All right. In general, the U.S. would seem to be in a stronger position in a trade war with China, because only about 11% of our gross domestic product is tied to trade. Some would say it's maybe 14%. I've heard somewhere around there, but it's nothing like it is for China. Whereas China is really an export-oriented economy. I mean, the World Bank says about 38%, maybe 40%, if you will, if I could round it off, of their economy is tied to exports. China has tried over and over again to try and build up a domestic market for its goods. They don't have it. The other thing that's been happening before the U.S. stepped in on this is other countries around the world, European countries, places like Turkey, certainly India, but the global south, if you will, have been looking at this predatory way China does international trade, and they've been putting up tariffs and other non-tariff barriers to Chinese exports for quite some time. So when the U.S. cuts off buying Chinese goods, or shuts, not completely, but shuts down to a large extent, China says, well, we'll just try and find other places to go. Well, you can try and find other places to go, but you're running into a global market that has already put up barriers to your goods and probably is a little reticent on getting these goods. And by the way, they're smart. They know everybody knows what's going on. If you're going to buy Chinese goods, guess what? They're going to negotiate some deals where they buy those things at a really deep discount. And that's less revenue coming to China when China is already in serious economic shape. There are some that say that the Chinese growth may be more illusory, economic growth may be more illusory than real. Even then, their official numbers are well below what their official numbers were years ago. They're sitting on this real estate time bomb, if you will, where they did all this development in real estate and the economy just couldn't keep up with it. So you've literally got empty cities. People put their life savings into their homes, and those homes were in buildings that were never finished because the real estate company went bankrupt. It was, if you look at how they did it, was almost like command economy stuff in a free capitalist system, and it was just a mess. And one of the areas that's messier than most is certainly in the area of real estate. And that is I still think that's a ticking time bomb that has not completely exploded, if you will. Although there's been some minor explosions that have been pretty significant with that. So, but if you look at it, you would say, okay, the U.S. is going to be more resilient. But if you look at what China buys from the U.S., they have a lot of ability to do substitution. We don't have a lot of ability to substitute a source for like cell phones and laptops and stuff easily. There's some things that China produces that we literally need to buy. And they can go elsewhere in the world to buy soybeans, but our soybean farmers are, the Chinese market is a big part of their market, and it props up their prices. The other thing for 25 plus years is China has strategically gone out there and taken over rare earths and certain key minerals like lithium and stuff, setting up international agreements. Look, they are not the bastion of where all the rare earths are found in the world. They just basically through predatory pricing and a variety of other, I would call scurrilous business practices, they forced out they basically shut down mining and processing elsewhere around the world and basically locked in this huge disproportionate amount of not just mineral mining, but also mineral processing. That's where it's really disparate, is in the processing side. And that's going to take a while to fix that. So we're more than a little bit exposed, because we're reliant right now on China for access to a lot of these key minerals that we need to keep our industrial base going, period. All right. To include our defense industrial base. So this is a big issue. All right. And this is a big problem that the U.S. is facing there. Now, with all that said, I'm going to go into what if. All right. What if there was an attack? What if with Iran? What if these negotiations go nowhere? President Trump has put 60 days as a limitation on the time that we're going to tolerate talking to Iran if we don't get a deal. Ayatollah Khomeini was opposed to these negotiations from the get-go, but Ayatollah Khomeini was convinced by his senior leaders that he had to allow this to happen for one reason. He was faced with what they called a two-front war. And you're probably sitting there going, two-front war, what's the other front? Is that Israel? Well, they see Israel and U.S. as kind of one front. The other front, though, was the regime's war with the Iranian people. And you got to remember everything that's been happening there with the protests, and not to mention some kinetic actions that have taken place in Iran. But they see this as if Israel and the U.S. comes in and wipes out their nuclear weapons capability, causes mass devastation, destroys their air defense capability, and probably goes after command and control targets as well. That's another way of saying senior leadership targets. That potentially that could be enough to cause a chaotic situation where the government is not seen as control, and you have, by many estimates, over 80% of the population wants to get rid of this regime anyway. So they saw the prospect of a two-front war. And that would be really interesting. Now, this does add a little bit of thought here, which is in the Middle East, we have seen regimes fall that we thought never would fall. Syria, most recently, with Bashar Assad, he fled. He's still alive for now with his family up in Russia, but did not go so well for a lot of the folks around him. We certainly saw this much earlier in Libya, and we all remember what happened to Muammar Gaddafi with that situation. And by the way, Muammar Gaddafi, I would mention, had negotiated with the West and the United States to shut down their weapons of mass destruction program, chemical weapons, and their aspirations for nuclear weapons. And he did cooperate. And it didn't stop him from being overthrown and eventually killed, actually shot with his own weapon. All right. So they saw that. They saw the chaos that happened in Egypt right after the government was overthrown, and of course what became essentially a military coup where the current government came into power. So they've all seen this stuff, and so the fear is what would come out of this initial chaos. All right. Now the other thing is looking at Russia, and this is a big question everybody's had: could Russia's regime fall? Now, there's been more reports that Vladimir Putin's health is in pretty bad shape. That they dope him up or do whatever in order to get him up there for those few public appearances he has. Although I will say this, I don't know how bad he is, because he gets up there and makes these speeches and public appearances where he talks for like 2 hours or 3 hours or something. I'm like, God, this guy just keeps going on and on and on. So I've always been a little skeptical of just how weak he may be if he's able to sustain that long talking like that. But there's a growing assessment that sometime in latter 2025, or certainly, and I saw this just recently again, that 2026, steam runs out of the Russian economic engine. Their sovereign wealth fund starts to run dry. They've been selling gold in order to keep the war going. And by the way, if nothing's achieved, if those reciprocal sanctions were put on places like China, and certainly one would say, well, Trump seems to have more of a rapport with Putin. On the other hand, I would say that things are kind of tough with China right now. If we were to put those sanctions on China, India, if you will, to stop them from buying Russian oil, that would even more dramatically drop the amount of revenue coming into the Russian regime. And the question is, could that trigger something? The other thing is, and I don't think this is an insignificant thing, that sometime in latter May, maybe in early June, at least according to the Ukrainian General Military Staff, that the troop losses that Russia has suffered in this war are going to exceed 1 million. That's 1 million killed or seriously wounded, taken off the battlefield. That's a significant number. And I don't know how that will translate over. Certainly Russians are, as a people, are kind of renowned for enduring an amazing amount of suffering. But if the economy is sputtering and dying, and they hit that 1 million, after that 1 million number, that could have some significance there. Also, there's more about what are called the mothers of Russia, which is also the daughters and sisters and others of those troops that are unaccounted for, or dead, killed, wounded, maimed, if you will, disabled for life. And they are becoming a bigger part of what's going on out there. The problem is, what happens if Putin was to be replaced, taken out, whatever? What occurs? Who takes over? It's not clear who the opposition figure would be. Navalny's gone, and there's no other opposition figures that really jump out. So that's a big problem. I would also point out that part of the pressure is the drones and the missiles and the special operations stuff the Ukrainians have been putting deep into Russia, to include into Moscow. that has a psychological effect. But the question is, which way would the Russian people go? Would they want another strongman in charge? And that's always been their history. Now, China, which way would this tariff war go? You know, the thought is that China, if they can't sell these goods, if they can't transition their economy away from it, you know, even though the U.S. has taken huge hits, you know, would they have massive layoffs of people? And this gets to the agreement, if you will, with the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, which is the Communist Party basically says you're going to put up with all this other stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that the people have to put up with. In exchange for that, you'll have a better future and you will have employment and your children do better than they are today. If that agreement is broken, if the CCP cannot fulfill on that, and of course, keeping in mind that China is dealing with a larger demographic bomb where it actually has a decreasing population, so less people of working age are in the population group, plus that real estate bust and what could maybe be a tipping point with that, it leaves open a question of what could happen in China. Could we see another Tiananmen Square type situation like 1989? And then, of course, what would come out of that? You know, usually when China has had these revolutionary changes, they haven't gone so well. You know, if you remember the Gang of Four in the 70s, if you remember the communists overthrowing the Chiang Kai-shek in the late 40s, and certainly everything, you know, throwing out the emperor before that, it's not quite clear what would come out of that. So anyway, all of this, I would point out that, you know, you're hearing these countries saying they're not doing that bad, but a lot of these economic statistics are actually concoctions of the regimes. And so I question a lot of the stats. If Russia says they grew 4%, I immediately say, well, maybe they actually dropped 2%. In terms of growth, just because it's the Russian government saying stuff like that. And you can say the same thing about, to some extent, the Chinese and the Iranians, although there is a little bit more visibility on what happens with China because of global markets. But nonetheless, there's a lot out there. So with that said, a lot of things to consider and a lot of what-if scenarios that we have to look at as well. And all of this tied to our strategic risk assessment of where we're going to put our capital, where we're looking in the world to source things from. Will the tariff war continue? It's having massive repercussions, not just in the stock market, but the bond markets. Could the, things that Mark Mansfield and I used to talk about with the importance of the global reserve currency being the US dollar, could that be finally upended? We don't know. Anyway, hey, thanks for listening to this. Hopefully you're watching this probably on YouTube, but certainly go to www.stratpodcast.com. It's kind of a link to a number of different ways to see this or hear this through all the different ways that it can be seen and heard. And of course, you can go to Hal Kempfer TV on YouTube as well. And hopefully you're going to tune in next week. I'm going to have Matt Baker on, Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel, a retired, kind of an expert in not just aviation, special operations, and doing amazing things going around the country talking about the revolution in drones and the threat of drones. And we're going to have a very lively discussion on the threats of drones. So hopefully you'll tune in next week and have a chance to listen to that. Thank you much, and I hope you have a great week.